Approximately 550 miles east of the Philippines lies the archipelago of Palau, a collection of volcanic and coral islands encircled by an extensive barrier reef. Among these islands is Peleliu, a platform coralline island measuring just over 6 square miles, a tiny speck in an ocean of blue that would become the stage for one of the most brutal and controversial battles of the Second World War. The story of Peleliu is not simply one of military strategy or tactical success, but rather a harrowing account of human endurance, questionable decision-making, and the terrible price paid by those who fought there. The Palau Islands had changed hands several times in the early 20th century, reflecting the shifting geopolitical landscape of the Pacific region. After Spain's defeat in the Spanish-American War, which concluded in August 1898, the Spanish government sold these distant possessions to Germany in 1899. The islands remained under German control until the First World War, when in 1914 control passed to Japan, which would hold them for the next 3 decades. By the time the Second World War erupted across the Pacific, Japan had transformed these islands into fortified positions, integral components of their defensive perimeter, designed to protect the approaches to the Japanese home islands. By the autumn of 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical juncture. American forces under Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz had been advancing westward across the Central Pacific, capturing the Gilbert Islands portions of the Marshall Islands, and most crucially, the Mariana Islands. Simultaneously, General Douglas MacArthur's forces had been pushing northward from Australia, securing New Guinea and the Admiralty Islands in a series of hard-fought campaigns. The two-pronged American advance had brought the war to Japan's doorstep, with American bombers now able to strike at Japanese cities from newly captured airfields in the Marianas. The strategic debate over the next phase of the Pacific campaign had been intense. MacArthur, who had been forced to abandon the Philippines in 1942 with the famous promise, "I shall return," argued forcefully for the liberation of those islands. He believed it was not only a military necessity, but a moral obligation to the Filipino people who had suffered under Japanese occupation. Admiral Nimitz, on the other hand, favored bypassing the Philippines entirely and striking directly at Formosa and Okinawa. President Franklin Roosevelt himself traveled to Hawaii in July 1944 to meet with both commanders and hear their arguments. In the end, Roosevelt sided with MacArthur, approving the plan to liberate the Philippines. However, before MacArthur could launch his Philippine campaign, military planners determined that certain Japanese-held positions would need to be neutralized to protect the flanks of the American advance. The Palau Islands, and specifically Peleliu, with its airfield, were identified as potential threats. Japanese aircraft based on Peleliu could theoretically harass American forces as they moved toward the Philippines. Thus was born Operation Stalemate in Musu, the code name for the assault on the Palau Islands. The operation was to be the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific to date, involving more than 1,600 ships and craft, and over 800 aircraft. Even before the operation began, there were doubts about its necessity. Admiral William Halsey, whose Third Fleet would provide support for the landings, had conducted airstrikes against the Philippines in early September 1944 and encountered surprisingly weak Japanese resistance. Based on these findings, Halsey recommended cancelling the Palau operation altogether and accelerating the timetable for the Philippine invasion. His assessment proved remarkably prescient, but with the operations scheduled to commence in just 2 days and extensive preparations already complete, Admiral Nimitz decided to proceed. This decision would haunt military planners and historians for decades to come. The Japanese forces on Peleliu were formidable and well prepared. Approximately 500 troops from the 14th Infantry Division, considered an elite unit detached from the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, had arrived on the island in May 1944. In addition to these combat troops, there were roughly 4,000 naval personnel, including about 1,500 trained infantry from the 45th Base Guard Force, along with maintenance staff air crews and support troops. There was also a significant contingent of Korean and Japanese construction workers. In total, the garrison numbered approximately 11,000 men under the command of Colonel Kunio Nakagawa of the 14th Infantry Division's 2nd Regiment. What made Peleliu truly formidable, however, was not simply the number of defenders, but the revolutionary defensive strategy they employed. After suffering devastating losses in earlier island campaigns, where they had contested American landings directly on the beaches, Japanese military planners had developed new tactics designed to maximize American casualties and prolong the fighting. These new tactics called for only token resistance at the beaches, with the main defense focused on interior positions that could not be easily destroyed by naval bombardment or airstrikes. Colonel Nakagawa implemented these tactics with deadly efficiency on Peleliu. The island's geography played directly into Nakagawa's defensive plans. The southern portion of Peleliu was relatively flat and contained the Japanese-built airfield, but the northern region was dominated by the Umabrogol Mountain, a twisted maze of coral ridges, steep cliffs, narrow valleys, and rugged peaks rising as high as 550 feet. This terrain, which would soon earn the grim nickname Bloody Nose Ridge, was honeycombed with approximately 500 limestone caves, many of them former phosphate mine shafts that had been developed by the Nanyo Kohatsu Kaisha, a Japanese development company that had operated on the island since the 1920s. Japanese engineers had transformed this natural fortress into an interconnected network of defensive positions, connecting the caves with tunnels and installing sliding armoured steel doors with multiple firing ports. This honeycomb system allowed Japanese troops to move unseen between positions emerged to fire on advancing Americans and then disappear back into their subterranean fortifications. The American assault force was centered on the 1st Marine Division under Major General William Rupertus, a confident commander who predicted the island would be secured within 4 days. This optimistic assessment would prove tragically wrong. Supporting units included the 11th Marine Regiment providing artillery, the 12th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion, the 3rd Armoured Amphibian Tractor Battalion, underwater demolition teams from 6 and 7, and the 4th, 5th and 6th Marine War Dog platoons. The Army's 81st Infantry Division was held in reserve and would assault the nearby island of Angkor. The preparatory phase of the invasion involved critical work by the Navy's underwater demolition teams, the elite swimmers known as frogmen. In August 1984, UDT-10 had conducted reconnaissance from the submarine USS Burfish, revealing a daunting array of obstacles, including concrete tetrahedrons, double rows of wooden posts 75 yards from shore, barbed wire, and horned mines. Most critically, they discovered that in some areas the reef was barely 2 feet deep at low tide, far too shallow for conventional landing craft. 3 days before the invasion, UDT 6 and 7 deployed in broad daylight to destroy obstacles and blast channels through the coral reef, working under naval gunfire that roared overhead, while Japanese snipers and machine gunners tried to pick them off in the shallow lagoon. The night before the assault, these brave swimmers crawled ashore to demolish rock cribs, posts, barbed wire and concrete cubes, and to set buoys marking the newly blasted passages through the reef. The amphibious assault plan for Peleliu was a masterpiece of military coordination involving 5 imaginary staging lines offshore. The farthest line, at 18,000 yards, held the large transport ships and battleships. At 6,000 yards from shore, landing ship transports opened their bow doors to release the amphibian tractors packed in their holds. At 4,000 yards, assault waves formed up opposite their designated beaches. At 2,000 yards, the amphibian tractors that had delivered the first waves returned to transfer additional troops from small boats. The final line, at 1,000 yards, was where the amphibian fleet crossed the reef under its own power, racing toward the beaches, while landing craft, with guns provided covering fire. An aircraft bombed and strafed the island. Submarine chasers, patrol craft and Higgins boats stewarded this complex ballet, maintaining radio contact and hoisting signal flags to coordinate the waves of assault troops. After days of intensive naval and aerial bombardment that some officers believed had destroyed every significant target on the island, the 1st Marine Division began landing at 0830 hours on September 15, 1944. The plan called for 3 regiments to land abreast on a 200-yard stretch of beach on the southwestern shore. The 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Lewis Burwell Chesty Puller would land on White Beaches 1 and 2 on the northern end of the assault area. The 5th Marine Regiment would land on Orange Beaches 1 and 2 in the centre, and the 7th Marine Regiment would land on Orange Beach 3 to the south. The plan called for 500 men to come ashore in the first 19 minutes. Among those heading toward White Beach that morning was Joe W. Clapper, born in March 1924 in Jonesboro, Indiana. After graduating high school in June 1942, Joe had enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve, and after training in California, had sailed to Melbourne, Australia, where he was assigned to K Company 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. Like many young Marines, Joe had enjoyed the friendliness of the Australians during his time there. The division had then moved to Goodenough Island off New Guinea, and in December 1943 had seen action at Cape Gloucester on New Britain as part of Operation Cartwheel, the Allied campaign to neutralise the major Japanese base at Rabaul. By April 1944, the 1st Marine Division had been sent to Pavuvu Island in the Russell Islands to rest and prepare for their next operation. Pavuvu had been an interesting interlude in the war. The tiny island home to a large coconut plantation abandoned by its native inhabitants when the war began required extensive work before it could serve as a base. The Marines had to construct their own infrastructure, and they battled an unexpected enemy rats and land crabs that infested the island, running through tents at night and sometimes nibbling on the ears of sleeping men. Marines held contests to see who could kill the most rats, with the winner receiving a bottle of alcohol. In typical Marine fashion, some would allegedly steal dead rats from each other to ensure victory. The island's name became a profane 6-letter word among the Marines. But Pavuvu also provided a bright memory when the legendary comedian Bob Hope brought a USO show to the island in August 1944, giving the men a brief respite from the harsh realities of war. On the morning of September the 15th, reveille had come at 1 a.m. The ships served steak and eggs, the traditional last meal before an amphibious assault. Then began the long process of transferring men from the large transport ships to the smaller landing craft, and finally to the amphibian tractors that would carry them across the reef and onto the beaches. When Joe Clapper landed on White Beach in the first assault wave, Japanese machine gun fire immediately raked the beach, sending sand flying through the air in deadly clouds. Years later, Joe would describe it as being like trying to run between raindrops. The optimistic predictions of a quick victory evaporated almost immediately. The massive naval and aerial bombardment had failed to destroy the well-concealed Japanese positions, particularly the bunkers and pillboxes that had been carved into the coral and reinforced with steel and concrete. As the Marines struggled inland from the beaches, they came under withering fire from positions that were supposed to have been neutralized. The 1st Marine Regiment landing on White Beach under Colonel Puller immediately encountered fierce resistance. A small peninsula jutting out just north of the landing area, quickly dubbed the Point by the Marines, contained Japanese positions that could enfilade the entire beach. Despite the intense fire, elements of the 1st Marines fought their way onto the point, but the cost was terrible. Also, landing on White Beach that day was Navy Corpsman John W. Bailey Jr., born in May 1925 in Goodson, Missouri. When his family moved to Santa Paula, California, young John had been determined to join the Navy after Pearl Harbor. At 17.5 years old, he had persuaded his father to sign the papers, allowing him to enlist underage. He would later recall his father saying, "I feel just like I'm signing your death warrant." John had enlisted in January 1943, been selected for medical training as a Navy corpsman, and by September 1943 was shipping out from San Diego. The Marine Corps, which has no organic medical component, relies on Navy corpsmen to provide medical care for its troops, and these docks would prove invaluable during the hellish fighting on Peleliu. Near the end of the first day, Joe Clapper's life was saved by a young Marine who should not have been there at all. It had been discovered that the Marine, whom Joe called Junior, was only 15 years old. His real name was J.M. Morsey from Harlan County, Kentucky, and paperwork to send him home had been initiated, but not completed before the operation began. When Junior suddenly yelled, "Look out, Joe, a Jap!" Joe turned to find himself staring into the rifle barrel of a Japanese soldier at point-blank range. Junior killed the Japanese soldier, saving Joe's life. Years later, Joe was still grateful that Junior, who should have been safely back in the United States, had been there that day. On the second day of the battle, Joe witnessed the death of a close friend, Fortune Orlando Rosencrantz III from Pennsylvania, nicknamed Rosie. A Japanese bullet struck Rosie in the chest, the round blowing his lung out through his back. The image of Rosie's death would haunt Joe for the rest of his life. That same day, Joe himself was hit by a bullet in the left upper chest area. A Navy corpsman applied a bandage, and Joe was evacuated to the beach and then transferred to a hospital ship offshore. He would later describe the beach as being carpeted with dead Marines, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting and the effectiveness of the Japanese defensive strategy. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments landing in the center and south made better initial progress, pushing inland toward the airfield. The flat terrain in the southern portion of the island was more conducive to the use of tanks and artillery, and by the end of the first week, the airfield had been captured. Marine F-4U Corsair fighters were soon operating from the field, flying close air support missions so near to the front lines that pilots often didn't bother raising their landing gear. A complete sortie from takeoff to landing could be accomplished in 30 minutes. But in the north, where Colonel Puller's 1st Marine Regiment faced the Umabrogol Mountain and its approaches, the situation was desperate. The combination of difficult terrain, concealed enemy positions, and aggressive Japanese defense created a killing ground. The narrow valleys and steep ridges, the sinkholes and straight drops all favored the defender. The hard coral surface prevented Marines from digging proper foxholes, leaving them exposed to mortar and artillery fire. The Marines began calling this area Bloody Nose Ridge, and it would live up to its name. Colonel Puller, known throughout the Marine Corps as Chesty for his barrel chest and aggressive stance, was one of the most decorated Marines in the Corps' history. He had served in Nicaragua, China, and throughout the Pacific War, earning a reputation as a frontline commander who led from the front and inspired fierce loyalty among his men. But at Peleliu, Puller faced a situation unlike any he had encountered before. The Japanese were not mounting suicidal banzai charges that could be mowed down by American firepower. Instead, they remained hidden in their fortified caves, emerging only to fire on the advancing Marines before disappearing back into their subterranean positions. Puller's response was to order repeated frontal assaults against the Japanese positions, believing that Marine aggressiveness and determination would overcome the enemy defenses. But the terrain and the Japanese defensive system made such tactics extraordinarily costly. The 1st Marines took appalling casualties as they tried to advance up the ridges and into the valleys of the Umabrogol. After 6 days of fighting, while the 5th and 7th Marines had largely achieved their objectives in the south, the 1st Marines were still locked in a hand-to-hand struggle for control of Bloody Nose Ridge. Navy Corpsman John Bailey described his experience on Peleliu as 45 days and 1,000 nights, calling it the horror of all battles. The conditions on the island were almost beyond description. Temperatures regularly exceeded 115 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the pre-invasion bombardment and subsequent fighting had destroyed most of the trees and vegetation that might have provided shade or concealment. Dehydration became a critical problem, made worse when some water supplies were discovered to be contaminated by gasoline residue from the barrels in which they had been transported. Men suffered from severe sunburn, their eyes sometimes swelling shut from the intensity of the sun's glare off the white coral. The coral itself became a deadly hazard. Artillery shells and bombs striking the hard coral surface would send razor-sharp shards flying through the air like shrapnel, causing terrible wounds. When Bailey wasn't out with the Marines as a corpsman, he worked with Graves Registration Service units, finding and identifying bodies for burial in the temporary cemetery being constructed on the island. It became critically important to Bailey that bodies be properly identified so that the families of the dead would know what had happened to their loved ones. The tropical climate meant that bodies decomposed rapidly, and in many cases, remains could not be recovered if they were left for more than 2 days. The smell of death permeated the island, a mixture of decomposing American and Japanese bodies, and the island serving as, in Bailey's words, one big toilet. Marine pilots reported they could smell the island while flying over it. By September the 23rd, after 8 days of continuous combat, Major General Roy Geiger, commanding the 3rd Amphibious Corps, made the difficult decision to pull the 1st Marine Regiment out of the line. Of the regiment's original strength of approximately 351 men, 11 had been killed and 138 wounded, a casualty rate of 54%. The survivors were hollow-eyed, scraggly, exhausted and numb. Geiger had visited Puller's command post and found the colonel shirtless with a corncob pipe in his mouth and a badly swollen leg from an old injury that had been aggravated during the fighting. Members of the Corps staff had the impression that Puller was completely exhausted both mentally and physically. When asked if he needed reinforcements, Puller had replied that he was doing all right, with what he had a response that would later be criticised as both prideful and unrealistic. The 1st Marines were replaced by the Army's 321st Infantry Regiment from the 81st Infantry Division, and later by the 323rd Infantry Regiment. The battle for Bloody Nose Ridge continued throughout October and into November, with Army troops facing the same difficult terrain and determined enemy resistance that had decimated the Marines. The Japanese defensive system proved remarkably resilient, with defenders able to move through the interconnected caves and tunnels to reinforce threatened positions or escape from areas under heavy attack. American forces employed every weapon in their arsenal against the Japanese cave defenses. Flamethrowers proved effective at close range, able to reach into caves and burn out defenders. Napalm delivered by aircraft or used by ground troops could suck the oxygen out of cave systems and incinerate those inside. Heavy artillery and naval gunfire pounded the ridges day after day. Armoured bulldozers were used to collapse cave entrances, entombing Japanese soldiers alive in the bowels of the earth. But for each position destroyed, there seemed to be another, and Japanese soldiers continued to fire from positions that were supposed to have been cleared days or weeks before. The human cost of the Peleliu campaign was staggering. American casualties totaled approximately 1,800 killed in action, and more than 8,000 wounded or missing out of roughly 28,000 men engaged in the fighting. This represented a casualty rate of nearly 40%, the highest of any amphibious assault in American military history. Some units suffered even worse. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Marine Regiment had a casualty rate of 71%, with only 74 men from 9 rifle companies left standing by the end of their time on the island. Japanese losses were nearly total. Of the approximately 11,000-man garrison, some 10,700 were killed either in combat or by suicide. Only 202 prisoners were taken during the entire campaign, and of these only 19 were Japanese soldiers, the rest being Korean and Okinawan labourers. Colonel Nakagawa, the Japanese commander, committed suicide after ordering his regimental colours burned, choosing death over the dishonour of surrender. He was posthumously promoted to Lieutenant General for his determined defence of the island. The battle was finally declared over on November 27, 1944. After 73 days of fighting, those small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to hold out in the caves. In a remarkable postscript to the battle, Lieutenant Tadamichi Yamaguchi, and 26 survivors remained hidden in the cave system until April 22, 1947, nearly 2 years after the war's end. They finally surrendered only after a former Japanese admiral came to the island and convinced them that Japan had indeed lost the war, and the emperor had ordered all forces to lay down their arms. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, played a crucial supporting role during and after the battle. William Taylor Stitt, known as Taylor, was born in June 1915 in Williamsville, Illinois, and enlisted in the Seabees in August 1943. After training, he was assigned to Construction Maintenance Battalion Unit 571 and traveled from Gulfport, Mississippi through the Panama Canal to the Russell Islands. The Seabees did not land on Peleliu until about 5 days after the fighting began, when the beachhead had been secured enough to allow support troops ashore. Once there, they set to work repairing the airstrip, working on roads, repairing damaged buildings, constructing ammunition, storage facilities, and building the infrastructure needed to support the combat troops. Even in the rear areas, danger remained. Taylor noticed a sniper's bullet lodged in the clock of his weapons carrier after one drive across the island, a reminder that Japanese soldiers remained hidden throughout Peleliu's cave system. The Seabees of Construction Maintenance Battalion Unit 571 lived in 16 huts on the island and remained there when the war ended in August 1945. After the Japanese surrender, Taylor and his friend Harold Groh from Mankato, Minnesota, managed to hitch a ride on a USO troops aircraft as far as Honolulu, and from there sailed back to California on the USS Missouri, the battleship on whose deck the Japanese surrender would be signed. The strategic value of the Peleliu operation remains one of the most controversial aspects of the entire Pacific War. The airfield, which had been the primary justification for the assault, played virtually no role in the subsequent Philippine campaign. MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte on October 20, 1944, just over a month after the Peleliu landing, and encountered far less Japanese air opposition than had been feared. It became clear that Japanese air power in the region had been greatly diminished by earlier American campaigns, making the neutralization of Peleliu's airfield largely unnecessary. Instead, Ulithi Atoll, which was lightly defended and captured with minimal casualties, became the primary staging base for subsequent operations, including the invasion of Okinawa. Admiral Halsey's recommendation to bypass Peleliu, made just days before the landing, had been proven correct. Navy historian Samuel Eliot Morrison would later write that Admiral Halsey had the right idea. They should have been bypassed. The National Museum of the Marine Corps would call Peleliu the bitterest battle of the war for the Marines. And historians continue to debate whether the high casualties were justified by any strategic gains. The battle did, however, provide valuable lessons for future operations. The Japanese defensive tactics employed on Peleliu, with their emphasis on defense in depth, using cave systems and interconnected positions, would be replicated on an even larger scale at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. American forces would face similar challenges in these later battles, though, with the benefit of having learned from the Peleliu experience about the effectiveness of flamethrowers' demolitions and the importance of thorough intelligence about cave systems. 8 Marines were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions on Peleliu, 6 of them posthumously. Captain Everett P. Pope received his for leading his company in an assault on a key position despite being outnumbered and running out of ammunition. Private First Class Arthur J. Jackson was recognized for single-handedly destroying 12 pillboxes and killing 50 Japanese soldiers. 5 other Marines sacrificed their own lives by throwing themselves on grenades to save their comrades. These acts of extraordinary valor stood in stark contrast to the questions about the operation's strategic necessity. The survivors of Peleliu carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Joe Clapper went on to fight at Okinawa, where he was wounded twice more, earning a total of 3 Purple Hearts before the war's end. He lived until January 2019, carrying the memory of Junior, saving his life, and the image of Rosie dying on that second day of battle. John Bailey also fought at Okinawa with the 1st Marine Division and later wrote a book titled Islands of Death, Islands of Victory. Published in 2002, drawing on his memories and experiences. In the book, he included a saying he had heard: "A Marine who had served on Peleliu died and went to heaven. When St. Peter opened the gate, the Marine saluted and said, 'Another Marine reporting, sir. I have already served my time in hell.'" Bailey passed away in June 2020. Taylor Stitt returned to his hometown in Illinois after the war, and interestingly encountered on Peleliu a friend from Springfield who told him, "If I live through the war, I'm going to invent a coffee machine." That friend, George R. Bunn, went on to found the Bunn-O-Matic Corporation in 1957. Taylor passed away in February 2012. Artist and combat correspondent Tom Lee, who witnessed the fighting on Peleliu, while embedded with the 1st Marine Division, created a painting that came to symbolize the psychological toll of the battle. He called it the 2,000-yard stare, depicting a Marine whose eyes seemed to look past the viewer at some distant horror that only he could see. The painting captured something essential about the Peleliu experience, the way the battle had pushed men beyond normal human endurance, leaving them fundamentally changed by what they had witnessed and endured. Today, Peleliu is listed on the US National Register of Historic Places as the Peleliu Battlefield and has been designated a US National Historic Landmark. The island, now part of the independent Republic of Palau, contains numerous reminders of the battle-rusting tanks and landing craft, abandoned artillery pieces, the remains of fortifications, both American and Japanese. The caves where Japanese soldiers made their last stands remain silent witnesses to the desperate fighting that took place there. The island has become a destination for military historians and veterans' families, a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. The Battle of Peleliu stands as a complex and troubling chapter in the Pacific War. It demonstrated both the incredible courage and fighting ability of American forces and the tragic consequences of flawed strategic planning. It showed that even with overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower and logistics, victory could come at a terrible price when facing a determined enemy fighting on favorable terrain. The controversy over the battle's necessity has never been fully resolved, and perhaps it never will be. What remains beyond dispute is the sacrifice of the men who fought there, both American and Japanese, who gave everything in service to their countries and their comrades. Their story serves as both a tribute to human courage and a sobering reminder of war's terrible costs, a lesson that echoes across the decades from that small coral island in the Western Pacific.